Journey to a land where stories guard the very heart and soul of history's past and tell of a future more glorious still. Walk through the tales of legendary creatures and fables of old, of gods and monsters, and of a people who still choose to believe in magic. Join DC and C. Michael McGannon in a Monster Guys podcast presentation for the retelling of both classic and original stories from the land of the Fae Folk, from the dark, the mysterious, the menacing, and sometimes downright hilarious. These aren't just any old stories. These are fairy tales.
Join us for a story titled The Changeling by Lady Wilde, followed by a short discussion on the topic. Narrated by DC McGannon, presented by the Monster Guys.
A woman was one night lying awake while her husband slept, when the door suddenly opened and a tall, dark man entered, of fierce aspect, followed by an old hag with a child in her arms, a little, misshapen, sickly-looking little thing. They both sat down by the fire to warm themselves, and after some time the man looked over at the cradle that stood beside the mother's bed with her boy in it, and kept his eyes on it for several minutes. Then he rose, and when the mother saw him walking over direct to the cradle, she fainted and knew no more. When she came to herself, she called to her husband and bade him light a candle. This he did, on which the old hag in the corner rose up at once and blew it out. Then he lit it a second time, and it was blown out. And still a third time he lit the candle, when again it was blown out, and a great peal of laughter was heard in the darkness. On this the man grew terribly angry, and taking up the tongs, he made a blow at the hag. But she slipped away, and struck him on the arm with a stick she held in her hand. Then he grew more furious, and beat her on the head until she roared, when he pushed her outside and locked the door. After this he lit the candle in peace. But when they looked at the cradle, lo, in the place of their own beautiful boy, a hidden little creature, all covered with hair, lay grinning at them. Great was their grief and lamentation, and both the man and his wife wept and wailed aloud for the loss of their child, and the cry of their sorrow was bitter to hear. Just then the door suddenly opened, and a young woman came in with a scarlet handkerchief wound round her head. "What are you crying for?" she asked, "at this time of night when everyone should be asleep?" "Look at this child in the cradle," answered the man, "and you will cease to wonder why we mourn and are sad at heart." And he told her all the story. When the young woman went over to the cradle and looked at the child, she laughed, but said nothing. "Your laughter is stranger than our tears," said the man. "Why do you laugh in the face of our sorrow?" "Because," she said, "this is my child that was stolen from me tonight. For I am one of the fairy race, and my people who live under the fort on the hill thought your boy was a fine child, and so they changed the babies in the cradle. But, after all, I would rather have my own, ugly as he is, than any mortal child in the world. So now I'll tell you how to get back your own son, and I'll take away mine at once. Go to the old fort on the hill when the moon is full, and take with you 3 sheafs of corn and some fire, and burn them one after the other. And when the last sheaf is burning, an old man will come up through the smoke, and he will ask you what it is you desire. Then tell him you must have your child back, or you will burn down the fort and leave no dwelling place for his people on the hill. Now, fairies cannot stand against the power of fire, and they will give you your child at the mere threat of burning the fort. But mind, take good care of him after, and tie a nail from a horseshoe round his neck, and then he will be safe." With that the young woman took up the ugly little imp from the cradle in her arms, and was away before they could see how she got out of the house. Next night, when the moon was full, the man went to the old fort with the 3 sheafs of corn and the fire, and he burned them one after the other. And as the second was lighted, there came up an old man and asked him what was his desire. "I must have my child again that was stolen," he answered, "or I'll burn down every tree on the hill." and not leave you a stone of the fort where you can shelter any more with your fairy kindred." Then the old men vanished, and there was a great silence, but no one appeared. On this the father grew angry, and he called out in a loud voice, "I am lifting the third sheaf now, and I'll burn and destroy and make desolate your dwelling place if my child is not returned." Then a great tumult and clamor was heard in the fort, and a voice said, "Let it be. The power of the fire is too strong for us. Bring forth the child." And presently the old man appeared, carrying the child in his arms. "Take him," he said, "by the spell of the fire and the corn you have conquered. But take my advice. Draw a circle of fire with a hot coal this night round the cradle when you go home, and the fairy power cannot touch him any more by reason of the fire." So the man did as he was desired, and by the spell of fire and of corn the child was saved from evil, and he grew and prospered. And the old fort stands to this day safe from harm, for the man would allow no hand to move a stone or harm a tree, and the fairies still dance there on the Rath, when the moon is full, to the music of the fairy pipes, and no one hinders them.
Of all of the fairy folk that are out there, I think changelings have always been a bit odd to me. And odd is maybe a weird word to use when you have a bunch of headless horsemen and, one-shoe cobblers running around. But there's quite a bit of depth, and maybe that's thanks to Lady Wilde, who wrote quite a bit about changelings and gave us such a rich background to pull from.
Yeah, almost seemed obsessed with that storyline.
Yeah, she wrote quite a lot about changelings, and I think that's why they are thrown in there with Irish fairies so much. Because honestly, changelings come from, or the idea of a monstrous child being switched out with a human child is actually pretty universal. You'll find that story as well in places like Scandinavia, or in Sweden and Denmark. Mm-hmm. But it's tagged in Irish folklore quite often, and I think that has something to do with it.
Well, that, and I think a lot of times, even though it's not always accurate, the world of fairies is often associated with Ireland.
There's a lot of depth there in Ireland, where you have fairies all over the place. Really, nobody does fairies quite like Ireland and Scotland.
That's true. But there are interesting discussions around the topic of the changeling from a mental health and a medical standpoint.
Yeah, it's kind of unfortunate because a lot of the older stories talk about how changelings, they would call for the old woman in the village to come and try to cure the changeling or to test the child to figure out if it was a fairy. And sometimes those tests were simple, just trying to get the child to speak or to see something and be surprised at what they see and exclaim, that they've never seen that before, which would get them to talk like an adult, which is obviously not something that an infant can do.
Right.
Sometimes those tests were much more cruel, using fire or red hot irons or leaving them out in, on a shovel for 3 days. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of a hard subject to talk about sometimes.
It's almost like a witch hunt.
Yes.
And with regards to children.
Yes, and many people believe that these children were autistic, or that even sometimes the parents were having some sort of psychological breakdown or experiencing some sort of illness. Some people have even thrown out like the Capgras syndrome, in which somebody believes that their loved one or somebody that they know has been replaced.
Yeah, an actual condition where somebody has the belief that their child has been replaced.
Right.
Even though their child is still right before them.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, people have thrown out all of these different possibilities, and because this is kind of looking back in retrospect, historians and folklorists are looking back at these stories, it's almost impossible sometimes to know for sure.
Mm-hmm. Going back to the discussion of fire, in this story, The Changeling by Lady Wilde, the man is instructed to take fire and corn. Mm-hmm. And it is said that there is one infallible thing to determine if a child is a changeling or not, and that is fire. Even from her own words, burn, burn, burn. If of the devil, burn. But if of God and the saints, be safe from harm. And it says that if it's a changeling, it will rush up the chimney with a cry, because fire is the greatest of enemies to every sort of phantom, insomuch that those who have seen apparitions fall into a swoon as they are sensible of the brightness of fire. So fire plays a pretty big role when it comes to changelings.
Fire and heat as well. I should say it more like this. The changeling and also the witch have been known to be susceptible to boiling water or some sort of magical recipe involving boiling water and iron and metal and sharp objects.
And often eggshells are used in the boiling water.
Yeah, there's a specific story about eggshells. And it's basically one of the stories where you try to get the changeling to talk. A lady has been told by a fairy woman, or almost like the witch doctor of the village, that she needs to test the fairy and show him something that he hasn't seen. So the lady boils eggshells, and it makes the changeling curious. And the changeling asks her, what is that? What are you making? And she explains that she's making some sort of, food out of boiling eggshells. And because the changeling gets up out of the crib and asks her that, she knows that it's definitely not a human child.
Yeah.
No human child can speak so eloquently or so easily.
And we're speaking a lot from the aspect of stories or fairy tales, but there is an actual legal case that took place around 1895, I believe, in Ireland. It's the case of Bridget Cleary. Her husband and her neighbors and her relatives murdered her and then burned her body. And the motive, they said, is that they were convinced that Bridget was a fairy changeling. And the active participants of the murder, 9 who were initially charged, maintained that story throughout the entire court case. So powerful is this belief and this story, this tale in history in some parts that, people have been murdered, just like witch trials and everything else, wrongly accused and certainly murdered as an innocent.
Yeah, like I said, it's kind of a hard monster to talk about because, yes, this is looking back in retrospect, but just the possibility of what some people and what some children could have gone through is really hard to think about, and it's not pretty.
Yeah, so there you go, ladies and gentlemen, The Changeling that we read by Lady Wilde in a dark and gloomy discussion for our first fairy tale. But it is a prominent piece of story in the realm of fairy tales. So
it certainly is.
An important one to discuss along the way, however gloomy it may be. So thank you for joining us tonight for our brand new Fairy Tales, a Monster Guys podcast presentation. As always, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Just look up The Monster Guys, or you can find us at themonsterguys.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes and leave us some love if you will. We'd love to hear from you and chat with you more about the world of fairies, and in particular this week, The Changeling. If you have any more information or discussion you'd like to add, hit us up. We'd love to hear from you. Good night, everybody.